Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's less about battles or grand castles and more about quiet hallways, small beds, and the lives of children who were born into privilege but quickly learned that being royal didn't always mean safety or happiness. So dim your lights, settle in, maybe grab a blanket, and let's float gently into the lives of orphaned royals and heirs, the kids who were supposed to inherit thrones but mostly inherited loneliness. It's easy to imagine royalty as glittering, glamorous, and perfectly arranged, with corgis or falcons or some other vaguely satisfying accessory. But for many children born into these families, the glitter was thin, the glamour was conditional, and the parental attention was, let's say, highly negotiable. Sometimes these kids were raised by wet nurses, governesses, or distant relatives who treated them as minor experiments rather than humans. Of course, the royals themselves often had their own issues: mental instability, chronic illness, or an overwhelming obsession with appearances, which made raising children, even heirs, a secondary concern. Take young Louis XIV of France, for instance, long before he became the Sun King. His father, Louis XIII, had more pressing matters, like keeping France from collapsing into civil war or ensuring the treasury didn't vanish entirely. Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria, while dutiful, was often preoccupied with politics and court intrigue, leaving the infant king to be passed from nurse to wet nurse with remarkable frequency. The little boy reportedly had one caregiver after another, each more or less following strict orders to prevent him from falling ill, crying too much, or developing inconvenient opinions. Imagine a tiny version of Versailles, bustling not with music or dancing, but with people silently judging whether a baby was sucking his thumb correctly. And while all of this sounds slightly comedic, for young Louis it likely felt a little like being invisible, even as the kingdom's eyes were ostensibly fixed on him. Let's float over to another royal disaster: Mary, Queen of Scots, who became queen when she was just 6 days old. Yes, 6 days. Her father, James V, had died, leaving her the throne, and her mother, Mary of Guise, faced the impossible task of securing Scotland's fragile politics while also managing an infant queen. So Mary was whisked off to France at the age of 5, separated from the country she was supposed to rule and surrounded by a court that alternated between indulgent flattery and cold political calculation. She was technically the most powerful child in Europe, but in reality she was more like a puppet propped on a gilded cushion, learning the complex etiquette of foreign courtiers while longing, perhaps, for familiar faces and a bed that wasn't constantly monitored. Orphaned heirs were not always mere pawns. They were sometimes subjects of intense family rivalry. Take Charles II of Spain. He's famous for, among other things, having a particularly unfortunate genetic legacy. He was extremely inbred, a product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage. But long before he became a sickly king, he was a child whose daily life revolved around avoiding illness, following rigid routines, and being constantly observed for signs of weakness. He lost both parents at a relatively young age, and his care was left to a rotating cast of advisors, doctors, and relatives. There was a kind of relentless clinical attention applied to him, as though every cough and twitch could be evidence of either divine destiny or catastrophic failure. The funny, or tragically ironic thing, is that this extreme care didn't prevent his lifelong health problems. Some of these children grew up with entirely constructed identities, set apart from their parents' attention. Consider Gustav III of Sweden, who was effectively orphaned at a young age when his father died, leaving him a crown prince under the guardianship of regents. Gustav's childhood was regimented, supervised, and meticulously planned, with tutors for languages, military training, and etiquette. But what he really inherited, in addition to the throne he'd eventually claim, was a profound sense of being observed at all times. There was very little space to simply be a child. Every gesture, every small rebellion was noted and cataloged for the record. It's easy to imagine him lying in bed at night, wondering whether he was a person or a project.
Being orphaned, or effectively orphaned, often had emotional consequences that weren't visible to the outside world. Young royal children sometimes formed attachments to caretakers that were far more intense than any relationship with their biological parents. For example, Marie Antoinette, though not orphaned in the traditional sense, spent a significant portion of her early life separated from her immediate family, being groomed to marry into the French royal house. Her letters as a young girl reveal a longing for connection, a mixture of politeness, longing, and frustration at the impossible expectations placed on her. Imagine trying to navigate a life where even affection had to be sanctioned by politics.
Sometimes orphaned royals were put in the care of relatives who were perfectly willing to exploit them. Take Henry VI of England, whose father died when he was just 9 months old. He was declared king as an infant, and his mother, Margaret of Anjou, had very little say over the early regency. Power struggles erupted around him, with nobles jockeying for control of the kingdom through his figurehead presence. Essentially, Henry was a tiny human chess piece, his entire life dictated by schemes far beyond his understanding. By the time he was old enough to comprehend the world, he had already been shaped by regents, counselors, and factional intrigue. The psychological pattern here is remarkably consistent. Infant or child kings and queens often inherited more anxiety than authority, more observation than freedom, and more expectation than companionship. Their lives were paradoxically both central and invisible. Everyone watched them, but very few nurtured them. Their days were structured around survival, etiquette, and preparation for a throne they were unlikely to enjoy fully, rather than the ordinary pleasures of childhood. We can also look outside Europe for more examples. In Japan, for instance, imperial children in the Heian period were often raised in cloistered quarters far removed from public life. Orphaned heirs, or princes whose fathers had died, were placed under the supervision of court regents and tutors, sometimes from a very young age, so that by the time they reached adolescence, they had almost no personal memory of their parents. Their lives were defined by ritual, propriety, and observation, leaving little room for mischief, play, or spontaneous thought. It's not that these children weren't loved per se, but affection was tightly controlled, and emotional expression was limited by protocol. Even when caretakers were kind, their care could be suffocating. For instance, Louis XVII of France, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, became effectively orphaned during the French Revolution. Locked away in the Temple prison, separated from his parents and with minimal human contact, he survived in a cold, regimented environment. His days consisted of brief meals, lessons, and observation by guards who alternated between neglect and rigid supervision. The world outside had dissolved, leaving him with nothing but the echoes of a life that once promised everything. While his story ends tragically, it illustrates the quiet terror of orphaned royalty, the isolation, the constant scrutiny, and the deprivation of normal childhood experiences. It's not all gloom, though, because some children, oddly enough, thrived, or at least survived, in these conditions. They learned early on to be resilient, observant, and strategic. Take Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose father was notoriously harsh. Frederick spent his childhood navigating rigid discipline, emotional distance, and high expectations. He learned to endure, to observe, and eventually to manipulate the court's expectations in his favor. In a way, the shadow of orphaning or parental neglect often instilled skills that would later serve them well in rule, even if the cost in emotional well-being was considerable. And yet, for every Frederick, there were countless children who struggled quietly, their sadness invisible to history because it didn't result in policy decisions or wars. Their stories are a reminder that being born into royalty was not a guarantee of happiness or even attention.
Instead, these children's lives were a careful negotiation between absence and expectation, observation and autonomy, invisibility and performance. So, as we drift through the lives of these orphaned royals and heirs, it's worth noting a common thread. Childhood for the privileged was often a paradox. They had wealth, tutors, and ceremonial importance, yet they lacked basic companionship, security, and freedom. Their days were filled with lessons in etiquette and governance, but the lessons in love, comfort, and human connection were often skipped entirely. They existed in shadows cast by expectation, and even when the throne was eventually reached, the haunting sense of absence lingered. As we prepare to float over to another royal story, one that continues the theme of childhood shaped by absence, just take a moment to imagine a small bed in a cold, quiet chamber, a tiny hand gripping the edge of a cradle, and a child watching, always watching, for a parent who might never arrive. The world of orphaned royals is a place of silent observation, meticulous caretaking, and quiet survival. It's a world that history records in names, dates, and dynastic charts, but rarely in the textures of loneliness, longing, and small triumphs of endurance. As we continue floating through the quiet corridors of orphaned royalty, let's turn our attention to the subtle, almost invisible ways these children were shaped by the absence of their parents. It wasn't always dramatic or outwardly tragic. Often it was the slow accumulation of small things, a missed bedtime story, a hand that never held theirs, a voice that was always polite but never warm. And of course they had tutors, endless tutors, but tutors are not parents. Tutors care about alphabets, arithmetic, Latin declensions, or ceremonial posture, not whether you're lonely or scared. Take the young Peter II of Russia, for instance. He became emperor at the age of 11, which in any reasonable world is already far too young to rule anything more complex than a lemonade stand. But Peter's situation was more complicated. His father, Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich, had died under circumstances that were suspiciously dramatic, leaving the child emperor in the hands of a court that alternated between indulgence and ruthless politicking. His days were filled with lessons in diplomacy and ceremony, but his evenings were often spent alone, in grand chambers that echoed with silence. You can imagine him running his fingers along the carved wood of a desk, or staring out a window at the Russian winter, wondering when or if he would ever feel like a normal child. And of course, normal for a Russian czar is a relative concept.
Across Europe, the pattern repeats. Young heirs often grew up under the shadow of a regency, where power was wielded by adults who were simultaneously their guardians and their overseers. One of the most striking examples is Charles Emmanuel IV of Sardinia, whose father, Victor Amadeus III, died while Charles was still in his late teens. Technically, Charles was old enough to govern, but the court's endless council meetings, legal disputes, and factional quarrels meant that he spent his days observing rather than acting. Orphaned or semi-orphaned children in such situations were thrust into adulthood early, yet they were never fully adults in terms of independence. They were adult in title, child in experience, and always under the watchful eyes of a court that treated mistakes as personal failings rather than inevitable learning experiences. Sometimes the absence of parents created unusual alliances. In Austria, young Maria Theresa of the Habsburg line relied heavily on her advisors and tutors after the death of her father. She formed close bonds with certain trusted figures, some of whom acted almost like surrogate parents. This was a double-edged sword. Affection came, but it was filtered through the lens of political expediency. If she misbehaved or made a mistake, the parental figures were not free to comfort, they were obligated to correct. She learned early that love in the royal world is conditional, transactional, and often mixed with a mild threat of disapproval. Interestingly, some orphaned royals developed highly peculiar habits as a coping mechanism. Take Ludwig II of Bavaria, known later for his castles and eccentricities. He lost his mother when he was very young and was left in the care of tutors and a rigid court environment. His fascination with fairy tales, castles, and elaborate fantasies can be seen as a kind of quiet retreat, a way to create a space where he had complete control, unlike the real world where adults dictated every waking moment. Many historians argue that the formative years of orphaned royals shaped not only their eccentricities, but also their obsessions with idealized worlds, fantasy, ritual, and structured perfection. Even when children were surrounded by family, the presence could feel absent. Louis-Philippe II, the Duke of Orléans, spent much of his childhood under the guardianship of extended relatives. His father was alive, technically, but more concerned with managing estates, deaths, and court appearances than with his son's emotional well-being. For children like Louis-Philippe, the line between having a parent and being effectively orphaned was remarkably thin. A parent might exist on paper, but the daily reality was separation, supervision, and instruction. Emotional guidance was a luxury, not a given. The consequences of this quiet, slow deprivation were subtle but persistent. Some children grew intensely self-reliant, developing observation skills, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of human behavior at an age when most kids were learning to tie their shoes. Others developed patterns of insecurity, dependency, or unusual obsessions. Still others, like Edward VI of England, found themselves racing toward a throne they barely understood, guided by regents who alternated between indulgence and harsh instruction. The combination of high expectation and emotional absence created a unique psychological environment, one that history rarely records except in passing comments or letters that hint at isolation, anxiety, and longing. A particularly illustrative example comes from Japan, where imperial children in the Edo period were often separated from their parents for political reasons. These children were raised in secluded quarters, instructed by multiple tutors, and prepared for ceremonial duties from a young age. Contact with parents was minimal and highly formalized, leaving emotional bonds largely absent. Their days consisted of study, ritual, and performance, while play and spontaneity were considered distractions from duty. In many ways, orphan European and Asian heirs shared a remarkably similar childhood experience, highly structured, emotionally muted, and heavy with expectation. Even when parents were present, their approach could be counterproductive. Catherine the Great of Russia, though not orphaned in the strict sense, experienced periods of emotional neglect in her early life, particularly as her family navigated the complex political landscape of minor German principalities. She later described in letters how she sometimes felt invisible, a small figure swept along by the currents of adult agendas. Many orphaned children, especially those born into dynasties, developed a heightened sense of observation precisely because emotional guidance was inconsistent. They learned to read the moods of adults, to anticipate expectations, and to adjust behavior accordingly, long before they had the cognitive or emotional tools to process the complexity of human relationships. Let's drift over to another royal example, Alexander I of Russia. He lost both his parents at a young age and was largely raised by tutors, regents, and distant relatives. His early life was dominated by strict education in military strategy, language, and court etiquette. Childhood for Alexander was less about toys and more about being prepared to inhabit a throne in a world where appearances mattered more than actual ability. He reportedly spent long periods reflecting quietly, reading or walking in gardens, perhaps creating mental space to process the absence that surrounded him. It's the kind of reflective, subdued childhood that history rarely records in vivid detail, but which likely shaped his approach to rule, diplomacy, and personal relationships.
There's a quiet, almost melancholic humor in many of these stories.
Orphaned royals often became masters of ceremony before they could master conversation. They learned the subtleties of flattery, the rigid rules of posture, and the complex patterns of court intrigue, all while longing for the simple pleasures of childhood. A bedtime story, a hand to hold, or someone who would listen without judgment. The irony is palpable. The very children groomed to inherit power were often the most deprived of its simplest joys. And yet, some children found ways to adapt. Queen Victoria, for example, lost her father at the age of 8 and was placed under the Kensington system, a strict, controlling regimen designed to protect and isolate her. While it was oppressive, Victoria developed resilience, an acute sense of observation, and an ability to navigate complex social hierarchies, skills that later defined her reign. The system was extreme, yes, but it illustrates a recurring pattern. Orphaned or semi-orphaned royals often internalized the rules of survival, turning absence and constraint into subtle forms of mastery. Even minor or overlooked heirs were subject to similar conditions. In Poland, for instance, young princes who were technically heirs often grew up in relative isolation, with guardians and tutors dictating nearly every aspect of daily life. Emotional nurturing was sparse, and personal freedom was limited. Their formative years were dominated by study, ceremony, and observation. When these princes eventually assumed roles of authority, they did so with a mixture of competence, caution, and often a lingering sense of emotional distance from others, a psychological pattern established long before they wore crowns or wielded scepters. So, as we continue this gentle journey through the lives of orphaned royals, it becomes clear that childhood for these figures was paradoxical, filled with privilege but lacking in personal connection, surrounded by people but often profoundly alone. Their experiences were shaped less by parental affection and more by observation, training, and the quiet pressures of courtly expectation. And while some managed to translate this early deprivation into skill, power, or strategic intelligence, others carried the subtle weight of absence throughout their lives, shaping relationships, governance, and even their approach to love. As our orphaned royals grew older, the quiet, lonely routines of childhood gradually shifted toward a new challenge: adolescence. For most people, adolescence is awkward, confusing, and full of self-discovery. For orphaned heirs, it was all of those things, plus a stage of constant observation, preparation for marriage, and the looming expectation of public performance. These children, already trained to follow rules, observe adults, and suppress whimsy, now faced a world where every gesture, glance, and syllable could have political consequences. Take, for instance, young James II of England, before he was king. Orphaned in practical terms during his early years, his parents' attention was inconsistent at best. He was thrust into a childhood that involved navigating the complex hierarchies of court, learning languages, and being prepared for marriage alliances that he could not comprehend. Adolescence for James was less about discovering himself and more about discovering how to perform as the person everyone else expected him to be. And of course, there was always the underlying awareness that missteps could cost him not just reputation, but security. In France, adolescent heirs like Louis XV were similarly caught between personal desire and dynastic expectation. Louis became king at the age of 5 after the death of his great-grandfather, and his adolescent years were dominated by advisors, regents, and a court that carefully curated his behavior. He was allowed glimpses of leisure and amusement, small joys like riding horses or collecting curiosities, but always under supervision. The juxtaposition of privilege and isolation created an emotional paradox. He could enjoy luxuries unimaginable to most, yet he could never be simply a child or teenager. Every smile, every laugh, every small rebellion had to be measured, contained, and ultimately approved. Sometimes adolescence amplified the psychological shadows cast by orphanhood. Maria Theresa of Austria, who had lost her father at a young age, grew into adolescence under the careful watch of tutors and regents who sought to mold her into the ideal ruler. She excelled academically and strategically, but the absence of parental warmth lingered. Letters from her teenage years revealed both an acute awareness of duty and a subtle longing for ordinary affection, a quiet melancholy that accompanied her learning of law, history, and diplomacy. It's a pattern we see again and again. Absence creates observation, and observation breeds careful calculation rather than spontaneous joy. Adolescent orphaned royals also faced the pressure of arranged marriages, which often loomed over them like clouds. Young girls, in particular, were groomed for unions that cemented alliances rather than personal happiness. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots, once again. As a teenager in France, she was courted by nobles, tutored in the arts of courtly love, and prepared for a marriage that would secure political advantage. Her personal preferences were secondary to dynastic necessity. This is not to say that affection never blossomed. Sometimes it did, but the framework for relationships was almost entirely transactional. Adolescents were expected to perform maturity while feeling little of the freedom typically associated with teenage years. For orphaned male heirs, adolescence often meant military training, education in statecraft, and an increasing awareness of mortality and politics. Charles XII of Sweden, orphaned of his father early, spent adolescence immersed in military lessons and political observation. He was prepared meticulously for a role that demanded not only strategic acumen, but also an ability to embody authority. The childhood absence of parents created an interesting dynamic. He had no personal anchors, yet he absorbed the behavior, ambition, and expectations of the adults around him, forming a psychological armor that would define his reign. Oddly enough, some adolescent royals turned their isolation into experimentation with hobbies or intellectual pursuits. Ludwig II of Bavaria, who had lost his parents or been separated from them at a young age, spent adolescent years retreating into music, architecture, and fairy tales. His eccentricities were, in part, a response to emotional absence. By creating worlds in which he could control everything, Ludwig developed a sanctuary from the pressures and scrutiny that had dominated his early life. The same pattern repeats across cultures. Absence fuels imagination, obsession, and the cultivation of private worlds. Adolescence also marked a shift in social observation. Children who had been quietly watched their whole lives now had to watch in return. They had to learn how to interpret the moods of ministers, the subtle glances of courtiers, and the social hierarchies of young peers in other noble houses. Elizabeth of York, though not orphaned completely, spent adolescence under constrained supervision and constant preparation for marriage. Her letters reveal careful attention to etiquette, phrasing, and tone, suggesting that she had internalized the constant observation she experienced in childhood. By the time she reached adulthood, she had mastered the art of appearing unaffected while being perpetually alert. For orphaned royals, adolescence often coincided with early exposure to mortality. Siblings or cousins could die of illness, accidents, or political intrigue, underscoring the precariousness of life, even for those in the highest social strata. Young heirs observed these losses closely, often internalizing the lesson that life was fragile and affection could be fleeting. Emotional resilience became a survival skill, cultivated in solitude or through carefully sanctioned relationships with tutors, governesses, and distant relatives. Interestingly, adolescence also brought opportunities for rebellion, but in highly controlled ways. Some heirs would bend etiquette rules, experiment with hobbies forbidden by regents, or develop peculiar habits as minor assertions of autonomy. These small acts of defiance were rarely catastrophic, but they allowed adolescents to reclaim tiny pieces of personal agency. For example, young monarchs might sneak books, engage in clandestine conversations with trusted friends, or practice arts not sanctioned by their overseers. These behaviors, though minor, were psychologically significant, providing a counterbalance to the suffocating regimen of courtly expectation. At the same time, adolescent orphaned royals frequently formed close bonds with peers in similar circumstances. Sometimes these friendships were the only places where they could express emotion freely, share complaints, or even experience ordinary play. The network of peers, other royal children, distant cousins, or noble companions offered rare relief from supervision. Yet even these relationships were constrained by hierarchy, protocol, and political considerations. Affection was real, but rarely simple. The transition from adolescence to early adulthood was gradual but relentless. Orphaned royals learned to perform competence long before they fully understood power. They mastered languages, courtly rituals, and diplomatic subtleties while navigating the psychological landscape of absence and supervision. By the time they reached maturity, or at least the age expected to assume public duties, they were both highly capable and emotionally restrained, products of a unique combination of training, observation, and absence. Take, for instance, Frederick the Great again. His adolescence under a harsh, absent father instilled discipline, resilience, and strategic thinking. Yet he also cultivated private interests, music, philosophy, and architecture that served as both refuge and self-expression. The balance of public performance and private sanctuary is a recurring theme among orphaned heirs. Survival requires mastery of observation, while thriving requires the creation of secret worlds.
Even minor heirs, those who might never inherit significant power, experienced similar patterns. Polish princes, small German dukes, and Italian heirs often lived in semi-isolation, with tutors, regents, and distant relatives shaping behavior and expectation. Their adolescence was dominated by study, ritual, and preparation for alliances, marriage, and ceremonial duty. Emotional absence persisted, but so did observation skills, adaptability, and the subtle cultivation of self-control. These early experiences quietly influenced not only the rulers they would become, but also the societies that depended on their performance. Adolescent orphaned royals also learned early the art of timing. A glance, a nod, a carefully chosen word could signal obedience, intelligence, or subtle resistance. Every interaction carried weight, even in the smallest courtly interactions. Over time, these children became experts at navigating complex social landscapes, not because of formal instruction, but because they had no choice. Survival depended on perception, anticipation, and strategic adaptation. As our orphaned royals moved from adolescence into early adulthood, the quiet pressures of observation and absence evolved into a more public stage. The young heirs were no longer just children or teenagers being monitored. They were now expected to perform authority, participate in governance, and embody dynastic continuity. And of course, there was marriage. Marriage, for royals, was less about love and more about alliances, politics, and appearances. The transition could be subtle or abrupt, depending on the individual and the circumstances surrounding their upbringing. Take Charles III of Spain, for instance. Orphaned relatively young, he was raised under strict supervision and heavily influenced by tutors and regents.
When he reached adulthood, he assumed a throne complicated by centuries of political expectations, territorial disputes, and advisors who had spent years manipulating the previous generation. Despite his careful education, the gap left by absent parents created moments of uncertainty. He was competent, strategic, and at times remarkably patient, but emotionally he carried the echo of childhood absence into every decision. His first marriage, arranged for political alliance, illustrates the pattern of orphaned heirs, a formal union designed to consolidate power with affection often secondary. Marriage, in these contexts, was simultaneously a relief and a burden. For orphaned female royals like Anne of Austria, early adult life meant navigating court politics while fulfilling the role of wife and mother. The emotional training, or lack thereof, from their own childhoods influenced how they approached these roles. Anne, for example, had grown up with distant parents and regents who emphasized duty over warmth. As a young queen, she carried this learned resilience into her interactions with her children and the broader court. The combination of absence in childhood and obligation in adulthood shaped her personality and governance style, often leaving historians to speculate about the quiet psychological impact of years spent performing emotional self-sufficiency. For male heirs, the situation was not dissimilar. Peter III of Russia ascended to power with years of rigorous instruction and preparation, yet the absence of a nurturing environment in childhood made him socially awkward and emotionally distant. His first marriage, to Catherine the Great, was arranged, politically motivated, and largely unsuccessful in terms of personal intimacy. Observers noted his disinterest in both affection and ceremony, which may reflect in part the enduring influence of orphaned or semi-orphaned upbringing, the pattern of observation over engagement, caution over spontaneity, and performance over genuine expression. Even monarchs who seemed outwardly capable carried the subtle weight of early absence. Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden, orphaned in practical terms during adolescence, ascended to the throne burdened with political expectations and the internalized habit of constant observation. His early training in etiquette, diplomacy, and public performance had produced a ruler who could navigate courtly politics with skill, yet emotionally he struggled with intimacy, trust, and decisiveness. The childhood lessons of observation and resilience necessary for survival became both an asset and a constraint. And yet, for some orphaned heirs, early adulthood offered unexpected opportunities for expression and influence. Frederick the Great, having endured a harsh and distant father, gradually transformed his experience of absence into mastery of governance, military strategy, and cultural patronage. The childhood and adolescent patterns of observation, caution, and adaptation became tools for both survival and achievement. He could navigate the court, engage in political negotiation, and cultivate artistic and intellectual pursuits with the confidence born from years of careful preparation and self-reliance.
Interestingly, orphaned royals often approached parenthood with the lessons of their own childhood deeply embedded. Louis XVI of France, orphaned or semi-orphaned in formative years, navigated marriage, parenthood, and governance with a mixture of conscientiousness and emotional restraint. His children became mirrors of his own upbringing, observed, tutored, and carefully guided. The emotional distance experienced in his youth influenced both the structure of family life and the subtle emotional climate of the court. In many cases, the cycle of absence and supervision repeated across generations, quietly shaping the temperament of entire dynasties. Accession to power brought new challenges. Orphaned or semi-orphaned monarchs faced the paradox of authority without full emotional grounding. Charles X of France, for example, ascended the throne after years of preparation under regents and distant caretakers. His reign was marked by careful attention to protocol, political maneuvering, and a personal reserve that may have been shaped by early experiences of absence. Observation, learned in childhood, now informed governance, negotiation, and public presentation. The ability to endure, strategize, and perform under pressure was both a product of orphanhood and a necessity for survival in adulthood. Some monarchs used their early experiences to cultivate empathy and strategic sensitivity. Maria Theresa, who lost her father as a child, applied the lessons of observation and self-reliance to her rule over Austria. She understood the subtleties of court dynamics, the needs of ministers, and the emotional undercurrents of diplomacy. Her childhood absence may have left emotional gaps, but it also provided the clarity and resilience needed for effective governance. She navigated early adult responsibilities, marriage, and motherhood with a keen awareness of human behavior and social expectation, skills rooted in a childhood defined by careful observation and structured learning. Even the smaller, less influential heirs carried similar patterns. In German principalities, young dukes and princes assumed responsibilities, marriages, and ceremonial duties in adulthood, often guided by a combination of distant parents and persistent tutors. The emotional consequences of orphanhood, self-reliance, caution, and observation remained quietly present, influencing personal relationships, political decision-making, and public demeanor. Their lives illustrate a broader pattern. The legacy of absence in childhood extends subtly yet powerfully into adult performance and governance. Marriage often reinforced these dynamics. Arranged unions required emotional flexibility, patience, and social intelligence. Orphaned heirs, already adept at observing and adapting, often navigated marital relationships with a mixture of formality and private strategy. Personal affection, when it existed, was layered over a foundation of learned caution and performance. Young royals discovered early that emotional expression must be calibrated, and that intimacy, like politics, required careful attention to timing, observation, and subtle negotiation. Even beyond marriage and governance, the shadow of orphanhood lingered in leisure, hobbies, and cultural pursuits. Ludwig II of Bavaria, continuing his retreat from the pressures of adult duty, immersed himself in architecture, theater, and music. The worlds he built were both refuge and stage, allowing him control and self-expression denied in the structured reality of court life. Similarly, orphaned monarchs across Europe cultivated artistic and intellectual interests, both as private sanctuary and as a subtle assertion of autonomy within the constraints of duty and expectation. In short, early adult life for orphaned royals was a continuation of patterns established in childhood: observation, adaptation, resilience, and cautious performance. Responsibilities increased, public attention intensified, and marriages and succession duties amplified the stakes. Yet the core psychological dynamics, developed in quiet corridors and regimented studies, remained: emotional distance, careful calculation, and a subtle, ongoing negotiation between public performance and private selfhood. As we float toward the later stages of these lives, the narrative remains gentle and steady. We're not focused on battles, revolutions, or scandalous intrigue, though those exist. Instead, we trace the quiet, cumulative impact of absence, observation, and early responsibility. Orphaned royals and heirs moved through childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood like shadows passing through grand halls, seen but emotionally unclaimed, present but subtly isolated. Their lives were shaped less by events and more by the rhythms of attention and absence, forming patterns that carried into marriage, governance, and legacy. As orphaned royals moved fully into adulthood, the cumulative weight of absence, observation, and careful training continued to shape their lives. By this stage, many had assumed full authority, managed marriages, raised children, and faced the daily burdens of governance. Yet the patterns formed in childhood, emotional caution, self-reliance, and strategic observation, remained quietly present, influencing every decision and interaction. Take Charles XII of Sweden again. Though orphaned or semi-orphaned in early life, he ascended to full power with remarkable precision, discipline, and emotional restraint. His reign was marked less by the exuberance of personal expression and more by careful calculation, methodical planning, and intense observation. Decisions were rarely impulsive. Every action was the product of a mind accustomed to anticipation and scrutiny. Even leisure activities reflected this pattern: strict routines, regimented social interactions, and a keen awareness of the courtly eye. The absence of parental guidance in early life had fostered a meticulous, measured approach that endured throughout adulthood. Parenthood introduced new complexities. Orphaned royals often approached child-rearing with the dual lens of their own upbringing and the expectations of dynastic continuity. Louis XVI of France, for example, navigated the challenges of parenting while also under constant scrutiny from his court. His own childhood, characterized by distance, observation, and structured guidance, shaped the ways he interacted with his children. Careful, conscientious, and reserved, he often approached affection cautiously, balancing duty with limited emotional expression. Letters and memoirs suggest that he genuinely cared for his children, yet the patterns of restraint learned in orphaned youth subtly shaped the dynamics of his family life. In other cases, the experience of absence translated into a heightened sensitivity to courtly politics and human behavior. Maria Theresa of Austria, continuing from her disciplined adolescence into full reign, exemplified this pattern. She ruled with a keen awareness of human motivations, alliances, and subtle power plays. The emotional gaps of her own youth had fostered acute observation skills, which she deployed to manage advisors, diplomats, and children alike. Her parenting combined structure, discipline, and occasional warmth, reflecting the delicate balance between duty and personal instinct. Even minor heirs, those unlikely to inherit major crowns, carried these patterns forward. Dukes, princes, and countesses across Europe navigated the pressures of courtly expectation, marriage, and family life in adulthood with the same cautious, observant mindset cultivated during orphaned childhood. Emotional restraint, learned as a survival mechanism, persisted in personal relationships. They maintained networks of trust, cultivated alliances, and often prioritized duty over spontaneous affection. In many cases, these adult behaviors were unremarkable to the outside observer, yet they bore the quiet imprint of childhood absence. The impact of orphanhood was also visible in the management of courtly ceremony. Monarchs who had grown up under distant supervision often adhered strictly to etiquette, ritual, and hierarchy. Ludwig II of Bavaria, for instance, maintained elaborate personal rituals and created highly formalized spaces for courtly interaction, reflecting both early isolation and the desire for structured emotional expression. These behaviors were often interpreted as eccentricity, yet they can also be seen as continuity, patterns of control, observation, and structured behavior that had provided security in childhood, continued to provide comfort and order in adulthood. Marriages in adulthood further reinforced these patterns. Arranged unions, common among orphaned royals, required careful negotiation and emotional calibration. Affection, when present, was tempered by years of observing social rules, anticipating expectations, and managing self-presentation. Peter III of Russia, whose childhood was marked by parental absence and regimented oversight, approached marriage with caution, formality, and emotional distance. His spouse, Catherine the Great, observed these patterns and adapted her own strategies, creating a dynamic in which early lessons in observation and emotional restraint played out in subtle but persistent ways. Parenting continued the cycle. Orphaned royals often instilled similar patterns in their own children, consciously or unconsciously. Structured upbringing, attention to etiquette, and measured emotional expression were hallmarks of dynastic continuity. Even when affection was present, it was frequently expressed within rigid frameworks, blending care with discipline and expectation. These patterns persisted across generations, quietly shaping the psychological landscape of European courts. Some royals, however, channeled early absence into cultural and intellectual pursuits. Frederick the Great, for instance, drawing on a childhood of strict oversight and emotional restraint, cultivated music, philosophy, and art. These private interests offered both refuge and agency, providing spaces for personal expression in lives otherwise dominated by duty and scrutiny. Similarly, Ludwig II's architectural fantasies and devotion to music illustrate the ways orphaned or semi-orphaned monarchs often sought private sanctuaries of creativity and imagination.
The shadow of orphanhood also influenced governance. Monarchs with emotionally distant or regimented childhoods often displayed heightened attention to political detail, procedural correctness, and strategic foresight. Charles Emmanuel IV of Sardinia, for instance, relied on careful observation and disciplined consultation with advisors, reflecting patterns developed in early life. Emotional detachment, learned as a survival skill in childhood, became a form of political resilience. Interestingly, the subtle effects of early absence were not limited to overtly political or public behaviors. Daily habits, personal routines, and social interactions all bore traces of childhood experience. Long hours spent in reflection, meticulous attention to ceremonial details, and a preference for controlled environments were common. The orphaned heir, accustomed to observation and measured response, often approached adulthood with the same methodical, cautious mindset, balancing duty, expectation, and private inclination. Even minor royals exhibited these patterns. Small German dukes or Italian princes, often overlooked by history, approached adult responsibilities, estate management, ceremonial duty, and family relations with care, observation, and subtle emotional caution. While these figures rarely dominate historical narratives, their experiences illustrate the pervasive psychological impact of orphaned childhood across dynasties, cultures, and political structures. As adulthood progressed, some monarchs sought to reconstruct emotional bonds lost in childhood. They developed close relationships with advisors, spouses, and children, sometimes displaying warmth and generosity that contrasted with early patterns of observation and caution. Maria Theresa, Louis XVI, and Frederick the Great all demonstrate this subtle balance. Early deprivation shaped patterns of caution and resilience, but adulthood provided opportunities to cultivate affection, mentorship, and creative engagement. Even late in life, the imprint of orphaned childhood persisted. Monarchs often reflected on early experiences, consciously or unconsciously adjusting their approaches to governance, family, and courtly life. Emotional restraint, strategic observation, and careful self-presentation continued to shape interactions with peers, subjects, and descendants. Absence in childhood had created patterns of resilience, control, and quiet introspection that echoed across decades. In essence, orphaned royals and heirs moved through life like shadows cast by early experiences. Childhood absence, observation, and careful supervision shaped adolescence, early adulthood, marriage, and governance.
Emotional caution, learned as a necessity, became a defining characteristic, subtly influencing personal relationships, courtly interaction, and dynastic continuity. Leisure, creativity, and private sanctuary offered occasional refuge, but the patterns of early life remained quietly present, guiding behavior, shaping temperament, and informing decisions across decades of public and private life. Even when death approached, the traces of early absence lingered. Letters, memoirs, and historical accounts suggest that many orphaned monarchs carried a subtle melancholy, a quiet reflection on lives defined by expectation, observation, and careful adaptation. These were not tragic stories of overt misery, but rather the gentle, persistent echo of childhood shapes that never fully disappeared. In this way, the lives of orphaned royals are both extraordinary and strangely universal. Extraordinary in the sense that their circumstances were rare, thrones, titles, and dynastic expectations, but universal in their human experience, longing for affection, negotiating absence, and navigating complex social landscapes. Even in wealth, power, and ceremony, these figures experienced patterns of emotion and behavior shaped by early loss, patterns that would ripple through adulthood, parenthood, and legacy. So as we drift toward the close of our journey, it's worth lingering on the quiet spaces, corridors of grand palaces, empty chambers, tutors pacing, courtiers observing, children learning resilience, caution, and observation before they ever learned to play freely. The orphaned heir, whether king, queen, prince, or princess, carried these early lessons forward, shaping not only their own lives, but the courts, dynasties, and histories that depended on their measured performance. As we continue our quiet journey through the lives of orphaned royals, it's time to linger on specific dynasties, those families where patterns of absence, observation, and careful self-restraint shaped entire generations. Here, we can observe the small, almost imperceptible eccentricities, routines, and habits that defined life at the highest social levels.
Let's start with the Habsburgs, who famously provide some of the clearest examples of inherited eccentricity and psychological imprint. Charles II of Spain, one of the most well-known Habsburg orphans, spent early childhood under the supervision of tutors and distant relatives. His father had died before he could exercise much guidance, leaving Charles in a world of meticulous instruction and careful observation. His adult life was marked by ill health and extreme caution in all matters, yet he maintained a fascination with religious ritual, ceremonial correctness, and a deeply structured daily routine. Everything had its place, from prayer to meals to the timing of his minor excursions. It's easy to imagine him waking in the morning, carefully noting the sunlight through the window, consulting with attendants, and moving deliberately through a day defined more by order than by spontaneous desire. Meanwhile, the Bourbon dynasty offers another illustration. Louis XVI, orphaned or semi-orphaned in his early life, carried the lessons of structured supervision into adulthood. His daily routines were precise, balancing ceremonial obligations with personal study, correspondence, and family time. Even in the midst of political turmoil, his behavior reflected the internalized patterns of childhood, methodical, cautious, and deeply aware of observation. Marriage, parenting, and courtly duties were all approached with a quiet form of conscientiousness, shaped by early absence, yet grounded in the practicalities of dynastic expectation. Some orphaned royals developed particularly noticeable personal quirks, often as coping mechanisms or private indulgences. Ludwig II of Bavaria, continuing the patterns established in his childhood, retreated into worlds of fantasy and architecture.
Castles, stagecraft, music, and elaborate theatrical productions became both a refuge and a private assertion of agency. Here, absence and supervision translated into creativity, allowing the orphaned monarch to exert control over a personal universe that contrasted sharply with the rigid demands of courtly life. His eccentricities were less rebellion and more carefully cultivated sanctuary. In England, Edward VI provides another subtle illustration. Orphaned of a father and under distant maternal supervision, his adolescent and early adult years were dominated by tutors, regents, and ceremonial training. Even as king, his life was circumscribed by expectation. Daily routines, study, and observation remained central. Edward's habits reflected the quiet imprint of early absence, meticulous, cautious, and often solitary. While historians sometimes focus on his short reign in terms of religious policy, the personal dimensions, rituals, observation, and careful adaptation offer insight into the subtle psychological effects of orphaned upbringing. Interestingly, not all eccentricities were purely personal. Many extended into governance. Monarchs with early experience of absence often displayed heightened attention to ceremony, procedure, and the emotional atmosphere of court. Catherine the Great, for example, observed patterns in her husband's behavior, courtly dynamics, and advisors' tendencies, often using subtle strategies to manage relationships. While she was not technically orphaned, her upbringing involved considerable emotional distance and structured supervision, highlighting how these patterns were not limited to those without surviving parents, but applied across childhoods marked by strict oversight. Minor heirs often mirrored these patterns, though on a smaller scale. German dukes, Italian princes, and Polish heirs approached adult life with measured habits, attention to detail, and quiet adaptation. Daily routines were regimented: study, ceremonial duties, correspondence, and observation. Even leisure, when allowed, was performed within structured time frames. Emotional expression remained cautious, but social intelligence and strategic perception flourished, reflecting lessons learned in early years of limited parental guidance. The quirks of orphaned royals often extended into personal preferences for solitude, ritual, and order. Observers frequently noted strict meal times, carefully curated libraries, or elaborate daily routines that allowed control over otherwise unpredictable circumstances. These small eccentricities, sometimes amusing, sometimes poignant, were outward manifestations of internalized patterns developed during absence, the need for structure, predictability, and self-reliance.
Sometimes these patterns manifested in interpersonal relationships. Monarchs raised with limited emotional guidance often approached advisors, spouses, and children with a combination of cautious observation and subtle calculation. Social interactions were measured, responses carefully calibrated, and affection expressed within strict boundaries. Even minor gestures, such as a nod of approval or a carefully timed compliment, carried layers of meaning, reflecting years of learned observation and strategic adaptation. For instance, in Austria, young archdukes who had experienced partial orphanhood carried these habits into adult life. Daily interactions with courtiers, tutors, and peers were marked by meticulous attention to etiquette and protocol. Leisure activities, horseback riding, hunting, or music were similarly structured, often performed with careful attention to appearance and timing. Emotional expression, though present, was filtered through decades of learned caution and observation. In essence, their adulthood was an extension of childhood, now performed on a larger, more public stage. Even in smaller courts, the patterns persisted.
Orphaned dukes or minor princes navigated marriages, ceremonial duties, and estate management with careful observation, strategic patience, and quiet diligence. The psychological imprint of early absence shaped behavior across all social strata of royalty, influencing decisions, relationships, and even the subtle rhythms of daily life. And yet, despite the constraints, some found creative outlets. Music, art, architecture, and literature often provided opportunities for personal expression within the bounds of social expectation. Ludwig II's castles, Frederick the Great's philosophical writings, and Maria Theresa's careful patronage of the arts demonstrate the ways in which orphaned or semi-orphaned royals cultivated personal worlds alongside dynastic duties. These pursuits offered both comfort and agency, allowing them to navigate public expectation while retaining private identity. Even as these royals aged, the quiet influence of early orphanhood remained. Letters, memoirs, and contemporaneous accounts hint at patterns of reflection, caution, and subtle melancholy that persisted into late adulthood. Emotional expression was measured, social observation continuous, and routines meticulously maintained. Public duty and private habit intertwined, reflecting the lasting imprint of formative years marked by absence and careful supervision. In sum, the dynastic lens allows us to see orphaned royals not as isolated figures, but as part of broader patterns of human development under unusual circumstances. The combination of absence, observation, and structured upbringing shaped not only individual eccentricities, but also governance, courtly life, and family dynamics. Even seemingly minor quirks, preference for solitude, attention to ritual, carefully timed gestures, carry echoes of early experiences. As we prepare to drift toward the final part of our journey, it's worth lingering on this quiet truth. Orphaned royals and heirs across centuries and continents developed lives marked by careful observation, subtle resilience, and structured adaptation. Their worlds were both extraordinary and poignantly ordinary. Vast palaces, glittering courts, and intricate ceremonial duties on the surface, yet underneath, patterns of solitude, observation, and psychological continuity that shaped every aspect of adult life.